The first speaker is Sara Dansky from the USA. She is in the US. She's a lawyer and the president of the US chapter of WDI. She previously served on the board of Women's Liberation Front, WOLF, from 2016 to 2020. And the talk Sara will be doing today is the importance of using accurate and precise sex-based language when talking about our rights. So thank you so much, Sara, and over to you.
So today I'm going to read a talk that I gave at the second annual summit of a group called ICONS, the Independent Council on Women's Sports, this past July. Regular attendees of FQT, Feminist Question Time, may remember a presentation given by a woman who went only by Mother of Swimmer in March of 2022. At that time, she spoke anonymously about how she had to watch her daughter compete against Will Thomas in the Ivy League swimming championships and how angry it made her. That woman's name is Kim Jones. She went on to found ICONS, and she now speaks out proudly under her real name. And I'm especially happy to report that her daughter now plans to go to law school to fight for women's sex-based rights in the law. The summit was an amazing opportunity to meet with plenty of women and some men who are fighting to keep women's sports for women, mostly from the US and the UK, though Australia and New Zealand were represented as well. I'm going to read the talk today exactly as I gave it at ICONS. So for many of us, I won't be sharing anything that we don't already know, but a lot of the arguments I made in this talk were new to that particular audience. A lot of people in the room and watching via live stream at ICONS are new to the fight to protect women's sex-based rights. I viewed my talk as an opportunity to make some arguments about the use of language that I knew would be controversial, but I wanted to get them out there because I think this topic is so important. So while what follows will be old hat to many regular viewers of Feminist Question Time, I'm giving the talk today as I gave it then, because I want to provide an example of how those of us who are more seasoned in this area can talk to people who are newer to it. As we get further and further in our fight to get rid of gender identity, we're going to encounter more and more people who are new to it. We have to be ready to engage with them. So with that, here's the talk that I gave at ICONS in July. I really want to thank ICONS for having me here today to talk about the importance of using accurate sex-based language when talking about women's sports. I realize that some of the things I have to say are going to be a bit controversial, and that's okay. There's plenty of room for respectful disagreement. I know that ICONS is focused on many aspects of women's sports, of which keeping male athletes out of them is but one example. I'm here today to focus on that particular aspect of ICONS' work and my views about the importance of using accurate and sex-specific language when we talk about it. There's several types of individuals and organizations that are working to protect women's sports. For example, there are non-ideological groups like ICONS and Sex Matters, conservative-leaning groups like the Independent Women's Forum, all the amazing female athletes who are here to talk this weekend, and biologists like the great Emma Hilton and Colin Wright, who focus on male athletic advantage, among other things. And then there are the TERFs. That's groups like Women's Declaration International. We're leftist radical feminists dedicated to women's sex-based rights, including sports. The heart of our work at WDI is the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, an international document that reaffirms women's sex-based rights, including women's right to physical and reproductive integrity and the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and girls that result from the replacement of the category of sex with that of gender identity. The document relies heavily on CEDAW, also known as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This is a UN convention that the US has not ratified and to which we are not bound. Still, it contains some principles to which we at WDI think the US and all 50 states ought to adhere. The declaration consists of 9 articles, Article 7 of which reaffirms women's rights to the same opportunities as men to participate actively in sports and physical education. It cites CEDAW and goes on to state that CEDAW's mandate that countries ensure the same opportunity to participate actively in sports and physical education should include the provision of opportunities for girls and women to participate in sports and physical education on a single-sex basis, to ensure fairness and safety for women and girls, the entry of boys and men who claim to have female gender identities into teams, competitions, facilities, or changing rooms, etc., set aside for women and girls should be prohibited as a form of sex discrimination. We do not compromise on this position. I'd like to suggest 3 main reasons for always using accurate sex-specific language and dispensing with the language of the gender identity proponents completely. First is the psychological damage that comes with using the language of gender. Second is that any compromise on this ultimately harms women and girls as a sex class. Third is that compromise doesn't even work because proponents of gender identity will never be satisfied with any of it. In 2019, the UK group Fair Play for Women posted a guest post called Pronouns Are Rohypnol. For anyone who doesn't know, Rohypnol refers to what is colloquially known as the date rape drug. In it, the author states, one of the biggest obstacles to halting the stampede over women's rights is pronoun and preferred name courtesy. People severely underestimate the psychological impact to themselves and to others of compliance. So in this piece, she was talking specifically about the use of wrong sex pronouns to refer to people in the third person. But I would argue that the points she's making apply to any use of language that obscures the material reality of sex. To illustrate her point, she talks about something called the Stroop effect, described as a delay in reaction time between congruent and incongruent stimuli. You can take a test online to determine how much longer it takes the average person to recognize various colors, depending on whether the color is written in the color being named or in another color. We can run through it quickly here. So the test goes like this. Looking at the next slide, see what it feels like to say to yourself what each color is. Remember, you're saying to yourself what the color of the word is, not what the word says. Okay, now looking at this slide, see what it feels like to say to yourself what each color is. Again, you're saying to yourself what the color of the word is, not what the word says. So for this, I asked you what it feels like to say to yourself what each color is, and I didn't time us, but when you take the test online, the system will tell you the difference between how long it took you to say the colors out loud when reading the first slide versus how long it took you to say the colors out loud when reading the second slide. For nearly all of us, it takes around twice as long to read the colors in the second slide. And the basic reason why is that our brains take longer to process obvious incongruences. Okay, so getting back to the Pronouns Are Rohypnol article, the author states that when taking the test, you'll find you have to consciously fight the conflict of input to your brain each and every time. And it leaves you confused, distracted, slower, frustrated, and fatigued, forcing our brains to ignore the evidence of our eyes, to ignore a conflict between what we see and know to be true and what we're expected to say affects us. She continues, using preferred pronouns does the same. It alters your attention, your speed of processing, your automaticity. You may find that it makes you anxious. You pay less heed to what you want to say and more to what is expected of you. It slows you down, confuses you, makes you less reactive. That's not a good thing. So the author's views, which I share, on why we shouldn't use, those are the author's views, which I share on why we shouldn't use wrong sex pronouns ourselves. She also encourages readers to do a similar experiment, examining what happens to our brains when we read or hear incongruent things that are written or said by others. For example, take an article you might read about who I will call Will Thomas that describes him using she and her pronouns. Rewrite the article, changing all the pronouns back and changing the name Leah to Will. Knowing that Thomas is male, how do you feel reading an article that pretends he's female versus how you feel reading it accurately? The author encourages readers to ask themselves questions like these as they read both versions. Do you feel anxious? Do you feel uncomfortable? Is your sense of injustice alerted? Her hypothesis is that if the use of wrong sex pronouns is harmless, reading those two versions of the article shouldn't make a difference. But for most people, it actually does. So why are pronouns rohypnol, according to her, instead of some other substance that obscures our perceptions? Why doesn't she say that pronouns are LSD or magic mushrooms, for example? She explains that at least for women, preferred pronouns dull your defenses. They change your inhibitions. They're meant to. You've had a lifetime's experience learning to be alert to him and relax to her, and for good reason. This instinctive response keeps you safe. It's not even a conscious thing. It's like your hair's standing on end. Your subconscious brain is helping you not get eaten by the saber-toothed tiger that your eyes haven't noticed yet. The article concludes with this: I want to be alert. I want others to be alert. I want people to see the real picture, and I want those instinctive reactions that we feel when something is wrong to be unblunted, undulled by this cheap but effective psychological trick. I feel like I owe this to myself, and I absolutely owe it to other women. And more than anything, I owe this to girls. I don't want to play even the tiniest part in grooming them to disregard their natural protective instincts. Those instincts are there for a reason, to keep them safe. They need those instincts intact and sharp. That's why I won't use preferred pronouns. Using rohypnol on others isn't a courtesy. Again, she's talking about pronouns here, but I would argue the same analysis applies to the use of any language that obscures the material reality of sex. That includes phrases like transgender athletes, if we're talking about male athletes. It includes the phrase transgender prisoners when we're talking about male inmates. It includes any and all language that concedes the idea that there is a sex class other than female and male, or that sex isn't real, or that it might matter. My second reason for insisting on using accurate sex-based language is that any concession to gender identity is an attack on women and girls as a sex class. Women as a class have always been oppressed by men as a class, regardless of the benign behaviors of any individual men on the basis of sex. And many of us are quite angry about it. There's a reason that suffragists had to fight for the right to vote after being denied the franchise for centuries, and that countless men and institutions fought hard to stop them. There's a reason that all over the world, men beat, rape, torture, and murder women and girls at astronomical rates. There's a reason that lesbians are routinely targeted for harassment or worse. There's a reason that men used to burn women for allegedly engaging in witchcraft. It was not on the basis of identity. No one bothered to ask women which pronouns they preferred. It was on the basis of sex. And now the entire gender identity movement denies that sex even exists or that it might matter. A couple of years ago, author Andrew Sullivan published a piece called, quote, "A Truce Proposal in the Trans War." In it, he proposed a number of compromises on what he framed as the transgender issue. I wrote a response piece, which I doubt he read because he probably has no idea who I am. In my response, I said, I've been thinking a lot about compromise and what it might look like in the context of the fight for the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls. The question I keep arriving at is this: why on earth should women be required to compromise when it comes to our own humanity? My concluding paragraph was this: those of us who are interested in finding compromise here must ask ourselves, how much of our humanity are we willing to sacrifice? If our answer to that question is greater than zero, we have to acknowledge that we're simply willing to leave our humanity and the very nature of reality at the door. No thanks, Andrew. I won't be compromising today. None of that has changed in the 2 years since. Lastly, I want to address the frequently made argument that it's important to use the language of gender identity in order to help people understand what's happening and to get them to listen. Because if we insist on using sex-specific language, they'll tune us out. I understand this argument, but I think it's misplaced. I have learned in my 8 years of working on this issue that there is no amount of compromise that will ever appease the proponents of gender identity. None. Radical feminist Mary Daly once said, I know that I will be punished just as much for being an itty-bitty feminist as for going the whole way, and so I go the whole way. I feel the same way about this. There is no amount of compromise that will appease the proponents of gender identity. They're going to punish us anyway, so we may as well go the whole way. By the way, we really can do this. I was once invited to address a group of Republican women in a fairly major US city, and I was happy to accept the invitation, even though I'm not a Republican or a conservative. We were chatting, and one woman asked me what we're going to do about the problem of transgender athletes competing in women's sports. And I said, okay, we can talk about that. But first, I want to ask you what you mean by transgender athletes. The room fell silent and tense. Then I asked, do you mean men and boys? She paused and then said cautiously, I didn't think we were allowed to say that. My response in the moment was basically that if you mean men and boys, you can just say men and boys. The sense of relief in the room was palpable, but I thought the interaction was fascinating. This woman, a political conservative, felt so socially and culturally compelled to deny material reality that she didn't think we were allowed, her word, to name it. We've got to get past this if we're going to have any hope of preserving reality, including the reality that women are female and men are male. And finally, I am finding that the people who compromise on language aren't even getting very far anyway. I know she's a bit controversial, and I understand why, but I don't think it can be denied that some of the most successful women fighting this fight are women like Kelly J. Keane in the UK, who never compromises on language. She has arguably done more to raise awareness of this topic and to get women talking about it than many of us. And she does it using accurate sex-specific language without compromise. If insisting on accurate sex-specific language is good enough for Kelly J, it's good enough for me. Okay, so that was the end of my talk at Icons. And I just want to note for this audience that I know there are a ton of women, radical feminists in particular, who insist on accurate sex-based language. Not only Kelly J, who doesn't call herself a feminist. Julia Long, for example, is one of the women I admire most on this front. And I know that it was Julia herself who persuaded Kelly J several years ago to dispense with any use of the language of gender identity. I used Kelly J in my talk at Icons because I knew the Icons audience members were likely to recognize her image. I'm very happy to report that as the session was closing and we were all milling about and chatting, one woman approached me and said, "Okay, you've changed my mind." That was only one woman, and I have no idea whether I changed any other minds. But even changing one mind is progress. We'll get there.
Why do you use the term TERF to describe women's rights advocates? Isn't it a slur designed by the proponents of gender identity?
So thanks for the question. I know it's controversial, and I saw plenty of chat about it. Here's the thing. At least in the States, the term TERF is being used to describe leftist radical feminist women in this political fight. I didn't used to use it because I viewed it as a slur, but then something changed. And Dave Chappelle proclaimed that he is, quote, Team TERF. And what that did is it introduced the term into the political zeitgeist. There's a woman named Pamela Paul who writes for the New York Times, who wrote a piece about J.K. Rowling, and she used the term TERF. The thing is, we are so frequently lumped in with conservatives that we need a word to describe ourselves as leftist radical feminists who are fighting for women and girls as a sex class. Like it or not, that term has become TERF. Kelly J uses it, J.K. Rowling uses it, and if we're going to be able to distinguish ourselves from conservatives, which I think is vitally important if we're going to win this from a leftist radical feminist perspective, we need the word. And if that's the word that's in the political zeitgeist, that's the word I'm going to use.
How are the press in the USA doing on this? Are they shifting to use sex-based language, or are they using pronouns?
It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. There are almost no media outlets that will use accurate sex pronouns in the mainstream. You know, we've got Redux, which is founded by and run by feminists, and they use accurate sex pronouns. They're just a smaller outlet. The Post Millennial uses accurate sex-based language, but they're also a smaller outlet. I'm happy to report that the National Review, which is a conservative-leaning outlet for sure, they use accurate sex-based language. At least one author there, Madeleine Kearns, a Scottish woman who lives in the States, uses accurate sex-based language. But for the most part, all of the media remains completely captured, including most conservative media. So including, for example, Fox News. They use wrong sex pronouns all the time. It's really irritating. I expect it from the mainstream lefty media at this point. But I just think it's appalling that even conservative media won't use accurate sex-based language.